G'day, I'm Stuart McDonald. One of the biggest concerns in fencing in the historical European martial arts and the Western martial arts that I'm concerned with from a sporting perspective, one of the biggest concerns is knee position. We find a lot of people saying things like, make sure your knees are aligned with your toes, make sure your knees are facing straight ahead, make sure your knees are not dropping in or not dropping out. And that's so true. It's really true. And one of the issues we find is that if your knee is pointing, say, across your midline or toward your midline, but your toes are facing straight ahead, it really doesn't matter where your toes are pointed because your knees will dictate the direction of your blade. Let's say you're doing a cut, a typical overhead cut from top to bottom. You're aiming for the upper left quadrant of your opponent. If as you land, your knee is pointed past your opponent, your blade will follow. And the reason for this is quite simple, really, if you think about it. The hip here is attached to the torso, which is attached to the shoulder. So if your hip turns this way, then your shoulder will follow. You can see I'm on a swivel chair. Watch this. If I turn my hip to my left, then what will happen is my shoulder will follow. I exaggerated the movement, but you can see that there. Now this is applicable to any martial art, okay? It's applicable to striking martial arts. If you overshoot with your hip, you're going to strike over here rather than striking straight ahead. Okay, so it's true of striking arts. If you strike with the elbow, okay, and your hip is pointed this way, you're likely to miss and end up striking here. Your primary target will be here rather than here. So we need to be solid, square, and focused, whether it's unarmed or whether it's with a blade. Now, what happens with the hip is the knee pulls this way, thus causing a movement of the hip with it, because the muscles that attach to the pelvis, in particular, we're thinking about things like tensor fascia latae, which is attached to the thigh, all the way down to the knee joint via the iliotibial band, and we're thinking about sartorius, we're thinking about rectus femoris, and then as far as muscles that are attached to the back of the pelvis, iliacus, and attaching to the spine is psoas major. So these muscles here, all attached to the pelvis and to the thigh, the femur. We also get our glutes, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, and then of course those mighty and powerful internal rotators. We also have the external placed hamstring muscles. Well, there's only really one that I'm thinking of there, which is biceps femoris. So these muscles here, all attached to the pelvis and to the thigh, when the thigh moves this way, they help to pull the hip that way. So the logic is that we need to align our knee so that we don't pull the hip across the midline. The problem with using the cue straighten your knee or keep your knee over your toes is that we are fighting against far greater foes than our knee, because it is how the motor program is wired in your central nervous system, how your central nervous system controls the hip joint is what's at play here. Sure, if you keep aligning the hip over and over again, eventually it might align itself up. But if you're sitting in positions day in and day out that keep the knees knocking together, and that when you go up and down steps or you go walking, you're knocking your knees together, there's no stability through your hip joint, then it doesn't matter how much you use the cue, keep lining it up. Point the knee toward your opponent or whatever it might be. At the end of the day, that can become a very frustrating and unhelpful cue. Now, this is not the place for me to go into all the details about cueing and about hip function. This is not that place at all. I just want to highlight the importance of the hip in these actions. So I invite you to have a look at what I have to do next and to understand something of how the hip joint chooses to work. So let's say that I have Glecade blade, a beautiful Tim Harris weapon, and I want to do a cut. I might be coming from this kind of position here. I'm inside my studio, which has a low ceiling, so I can't do a proper cut, but I want to demonstrate the movement of my arm regardless. So if I'm in this position here and I wish to do a cut, okay, what I'm talking about with the knee is this action here. We see the cut, someone cuts, comes across the body, and then they overshoot, and typically the feet might point straight ahead, but the knee does this action. Functionally, what that looks like is this. It pulls us over. And often the person will be doing some kind of weird thing with their hips, and their knee will be pointed across the midline. Now, I am over-exaggerating this, very much so. Now, let's try it again. We do the cut, okay? And something strange happens like this. And we say, fix it up, fix it up. And so they start just trying to go for a forward cut. And it keeps on doing weird things, and they fall. And so then we think, well, let's try teaching some kind of a lunge position maybe. So we come down into our standard position. We might be defending against the outside guard, the outside quadrant, and defend against that line. We come for the thrust, okay? The blade comes up, we thrust, and we want to ideally have the body in line, like so. So we can see that there's a beautiful line from the tip of the blade all the way through to the rear foot. But what we often find happening is something akin to this. Thrust, okay, and you see how my knee here, this one, is now pointed over this way, even though my toes are facing straight ahead. What this does is, pulls my body around into an unwieldy position like this. We go thrust, and now my thrust, my point, is all the way over here, and you can see that I am rotated around rather than being aligned like this. Here, thrust. We want to have that beautiful line. Now I'm a little bit turned in on my toes. That's a story for another day. What we want to try and do is understand where that movement's coming from. And it's quite simple, really. The movement is coming from the hip. When I plant this foot down in this position, if I'm going straight ahead and I plant it down, whatever I'm doing, when it lands, these muscles here need to activate just before it lands on the ground. So I lift it up, these muscles here activate just before it lands on the ground, and they keep it in line. You can see there that my knee stays in line with my hip mostly. If, however, they're not activating properly and controlling the descent, then when they land, what happens is they don't activate well. And these muscles, which are also controlling the descent, are able to pull the knee to the left. The foot can follow, in which case you're going to travel over here as your line of defense. What we need to then do is work out ways to do lunges, lunging and stepping kind of actions where these muscles and these ones keep the pelvis neutral and they keep the knee in line with the hip. So that when I bounce up and down in that lunge position, the hip does not jut out to one side and the knee does not go down even if the hip is aligned. We need to keep them all nice and neutral. So that's one thing you can try and work on, is work on doing lunging actions without any movement of the hip and without any movement of the knee. So that the toe, the knee and the hip remain in the one line. Bang. Just like that. You can do exercises like that. It's better to have someone watching you than to use, and it's better to use a mirror, but it's much better to have someone watching you because they can see things at first that you won't be able to see yourself. Increase hip control and the knee will follow. It's very simple. But the moral of the story is control your hip and the rest will follow. That means we have to train the hip in a controlled manner, maintaining neutrality. okay? A neutral line between the toe, the knee, and the hip in all directions. I have a course called The Hip in 360 Degrees, which covers just this issue. It looks at the functional anatomy of the hip all the way around, how the muscles attach, how they insert, how they pull it left, right, up, down, and it's a really great tool that helps you to assess movement in multiple scenarios. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I trust that you can find some great applications for this concept of hip control in the lunge.